This is Professor Arevalo, and I would like to continue our lesson on the topic of market equilibrium. Going back to our discussion, market equilibrium occurs where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. So we'll now start from the concept of market equilibrium, the basic definition. So we have here the term price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium, and equilibrium point. Because at market equilibrium, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So that on the Cartesian plane where the demand curve and the supply curve are plotted at the same time, we see that intersection point between the demand curve and the supply curve. So that the corresponding price of that point of intersection is called price equilibrium, and the corresponding quantity of that point of intersection is called the quantity equilibrium. Price equilibrium is the level of price at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied of the commodity per unit of time. While the quantity equilibrium is the level of Q at which the amount of the commodity that buyers are willing to buy equals the amount of the commodity that sellers are willing to sell at a specific time period at a given price. Now, what is that equilibrium point? Again, the equilibrium point is the point of intersection between the demand and the supply curves. Let us consider demand and supply equations here to solve for price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. Here we have QD equals to 25 minus 5P and QS equals to 10 plus 2P. So since we are computing for the price at which there is equilibrium in the market between the demand and supply, we have to now substitute the quantity supplied to quantity demanded. Not substitute, but we have to equate rather the quantity supplied to quantity demanded. Since quantity supplied is 10 plus 2P and quantity demanded is 25 minus 5P, by equating the two, we now have 10 plus 2P equals 25 minus 5P. And so, let's bring all those terms with P to the left side of the equation and the whole numbers to be on the right side of the equation. So, we now have 2P plus 5P. Take note that the negative 5P previously on the right side of the equation now becomes positive 5P when transposed to the other side of the equality sign. So we now have 2P plus 5P is equal to 7P. And so in the right side, to the right side of the equation, we have 25 minus 10 equals 15. So 7P is equal to 15. Solving for P, we now have 15 over 7. And that P that we have solved is already what we refer to as the price equilibrium. Therefore, the price equilibrium is 2.14 pesos per unit. Now let us compute for the quantity equilibrium. In solving for the quantity equilibrium, we can use any of the demand and supply equation as a reference. So let us suppose to use the supply equation as our reference. We can now substitute the computed price equilibrium to the P of this equation. So by substituting the price equilibrium of 2.14 to the P variable of the supply equation, we now have 10 plus 2p is equal to 10 plus 2 times 2.14. So that makes it to 14.28 after simplifying. So the Q of 14.28 is now the value of quantity equilibrium. Again, the quantity equilibrium is the level of Q at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded at a given price level. So here now, we can see that intersection point between the demand curve and the supply curve, and that is basically equal to that value of 14 point something and 2 point something for price equilibrium. So how are we going to plot the demand and the supply curves? We first, of course, have to prepare for the demand and supply schedules. To the left side is our demand schedule, and to the right side is our supply schedule. So we have to always start from the value of the Q-intercept. And on the demand side, the Q-intercept is 25. That means if the price is 0, quantity is 25. And to the supply side, our value of A is 10, which means that the Q-intercept is 10 and 0. So that if the price is 0, quantity supplied is equal to 10. Now, going farther to our rows of the schedules, for the demand schedule, after writing, of course, the intercept as our first paired of value on the table, we now have to proceed to the slope. According to our slope, for the demand, since it has a value of -5, that means that the denominator is 1, it can be said that for every increase in price by 1 peso, quantity demanded will decrease by 5 units. So notice that every time we increase price by 1 peso, quantity demanded decreases by 5 units. So from 0 price, there is a corresponding quantity of 25. And when we increase our price by 1 peso, we now have quantity demanded of 20. And when the price now becomes 2 pesos, quantity demanded now is 15, and so on and so forth. For the supply schedule, we start again from the intercept, which is paired value of 10 and 0. That means to say, for a price of 0, quantity supplied is 10. And every time we increase the price by 1 peso, quantity supplied increases also by 2 units as given by the slope of 2 over 1, or a slope of 2 for the supply equation. So every time we increase price by 1 peso, quantity supplied increases also by 2 units. Thus we have here quantities of 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20 corresponding to the prices 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So by plotting these two schedules on a Cartesian planes, we now have a downward sloping curve and upward sloping curve. The downward sloping curve represents the demand equation, or the demand curve rather, and the upward sloping curve represents the supply curve. So notice that at the point of intersection, which we refer to as equilibrium point, there is that corresponding price level which is equivalent to price equilibrium, that is 2.14. And the quantity equilibrium is 14.28, about nearly 15. So that is how we can find for the price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium. Now, what about, so take note of this value of the price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium, which graphically the values of price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium are highlighted by the red numbers on the Cartesian plane. Let us continue. What about if we want to know the price at which a surplus occur? So here, we will be computing for the price when surplus or shortage occur. Let us again make use of the same equations, demand equation and supply equation. And the demand equation is given by 25 minus 5p. Supply equation is given by Q equals to 10 plus 2p. And let us solve this problem. We want to know the price when surplus of 20 units occur. So, by solving the price at which a surplus or a shortage occur, we have to begin from the assumption that quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So QS is equal to QD. And our QS is 10 plus 2P. Now, our QD is 25 minus 5P. But since there is a surplus of 20 units in the given problem, let us introduce these 20 units as a minus to the supply side by 20 units. We have deducted 20 units from the supply side because there is a surplus of 20 units. Our goal is to balance. So when there is a surplus of 20 units, we have to subtract 20 units from the supply equation given in the assumption of QS equal to QD. So we actually adjusted supply here by subtracting the 20 units from the given supply equation. Again, when there is a surplus and we want to adjust the supply, that surplus of 20 units will have to be subtracted from the given supply equation. So that this is now 10 plus 2P minus 20. If we have adjusted already the supply curve, no adjustment should be made to the demand equation. Again, if we have already adjusted the supply equation, no need to adjust the demand equation. Okay, adjustment should only be made either in the demand or in the supply equation. So we are just here adjusting the supply equation. So instead of us just writing 10 plus 2P for supply, we now have to write 10 plus 2P minus 20. Again, the minus 20 is because there is a surplus of 20 units. A surplus, to balance the equation, should be deducted from the supply because there is an oversupply, so we have to deduct that surplus of 20. So That is why we have minus 20 as introduced in the balancing equation. So we can now solve for P, and we can now say 10 plus 2P is equal to 25 minus 5P. Take note that we have already made adjustments. So 2P plus 5P is now equal to 25 plus 10P. We just brought all those terms with P on the right side of the equation, and the whole number, we transpose them on the left side of the equation. So we now have 7P is equal to 25. And to solve for P, we have 35 over 7. Therefore, it is equal to 5 pesos. So price is equal to 5 pesos when the surplus of 20 units can occur. So that is our way of solving. Again, when we impose a price of 5 pesos, it will lead to a surplus of 20 units. Another example, another problem that we're going to consider: what is the price when surplus of 20 units occur? Again, the same problem as in the previous slide, but what we are to adjust now is the demand side, not the supply side, because there is a surplus. Surplus means that the demand is too small compared to the supply. So in order to balance the demand and the supply, we need to increase the demand by that amount of surplus. So in our balancing equation, QS equals to QD, we adjust the demand by adding on the demand equation to the 20 units, the surplus of 20 units. So that the equation now will be QS is equal to QD equals 10 plus 2P, or rather, since the supply is 10 plus 2P and the demand now is 100 minus 5P plus 20, we can now bring all those terms with P to the left side and the whole numbers to the right side. So 2P plus 5P is equal to 120 minus 10. So we now have 70 is equal to 110. Therefore, if we will solve for the price now is equal to 110 over 7, which means that the price is 17 pesos and 40 centavos to result to a surplus of 20 units. Now, what if there is a shortage of 20 units? How can we be able to compute for the price when a shortage of 20 units occur? So take note that what we will do is to adjust the supply side. Adjusting the supply side, we have to consider the condition that there is a shortage. Meaning to say that the demand or the supply is smaller. The supply is smaller than the demand. So what we have to do when we adjust the supply is to increase the supply by that amount of shortage. So we introduce the increasing of 20 units, which is the value of the shortage, to our supply equation. So our supply equation now will be 10 plus 2P plus 20. And the demand equation remains the same as 100 minus 5p, since we are only adjusting the supply. So let us bring all those terms with p to the left side and the whole numbers to the right side of the equality sign. So we now have 2p plus 5p is equal to 100 minus 30. So that 7p is equal now to 70. If we solve now for the price is equal to 70 over 7, which is equal to 10 pesos per unit. So to interpret, if we set the price equal to 10 pesos, a shortage, this is a shortage, not surplus. A shortage of 20 units can occur. So please take note that there is a typographical error stated in this result. What is written here is a surplus. That is actually a shortage of 20 units. Okay? So that's a shortage of 20 units. Now let us move on. Here on the next slide, same situation, there is a shortage of 20 units, but what we are adjusting is the demand. So if we are to make adjustment to the demand equation, it will no longer be equal to 100 minus 5p. The fact that there is a shortage, meaning to say the demand is higher than the supply when the shortage occurs, so that we can balance the demand and the supply, we have to deduct some amount from the demand. So a shortage of 20 should be introduced in our demand equation, which is negative 20. Again, when there is a shortage, demand is higher than the supply. So by adjusting the demand side, we have to deduct the amount of shortage to our demand equation. So our demand equation now will equal to 100 minus 5p minus 20, so that it will become 80 minus 5p. Since the given supply equation is 10 plus 2p, and now the adjusted demand equation is 80 minus 5p, we can now equate the demand and supply equations. So we have now 10 plus 2p is equal to 80 minus 5p. And bringing all those terms with p to the right side of the supply of the equality sign, and bringing the whole number to the, bringing the terms with p to the left side of the equality sign and the whole number to the right side of the equality sign, we now have 2p plus 5p is equal to 80 minus 10. And so simplifying, we have 7p is equal to 70. And therefore, to solve for p, we have p equals to 70 over 7, which is equal to 10 pesos. Now, what is this 10 pesos? This is the price level at which there will be a shortage of 20 units to occur. Now, again, there is a typographical error introduced in the solution. There is that word surplus that is supposed to be shortage. So 10 pesos per unit results in a shortage of 20 units. So please take note of the typographical error introduced to the bottom of this presentation. The word surplus should be replaced by the word shortage, since what we are analyzing here is shortage. So that is the end of our presentation on market equilibrium. I hope after this session, you will already be able to compute for the price equilibrium, the quantity equilibrium, the price at which a surplus occur, and the price at which a shortage occur. So again, I would like to reiterate that when there is a surplus or shortage, you can actually either adjust the supply side or the demand side. Now, if you have adjusted the supply side, the only change will be the supply equation. But if you will adjust the demand side, the demand equation will change. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson.